Thank you. And I'm so pleased to be leading this meaningful conversation for Z3 2020 Visions for a Shared Future. And today we'll be talking about the struggle for Soviet Jewry, and more specifically about the lessons we can draw from the struggle from Soviet Jewry for today. And we're lucky enough to have with us two veteran leaders of the struggle for Soviet Jewry. I am Rachel Sharansky Danzinger. I am not a veteran leader of the struggle for Soviet Jewry, but it is my honor to introduce my father, Natan Sharansky, who spent 9 years in the Soviet Gulag after becoming a leading activist both as a refusenik in Moscow and as a human rights activist and dissident. And Rav Avi Weiss, who led countless demonstrations and countless operations in the free world to help people like my father and all of Soviet Jewry to lead meaningful Jewish life and freedom. Now, of course, both my father and Rav Avi Weiss, our dear friend, have done a great many things since then. My father has been a minister in many Israeli governments and then spent 9 years as chairman of the Jewish Agency. And Rav Avi reshaped, in a sense, the map of Jewish life in America by founding rabbinic schools that changed both the scope of what Orthodox Jews represent and do, and of course, the place of women in leadership roles in the Orthodox world. But before we get to that, and we will touch upon these things, we should go back to the struggle for Soviet Jewry, the young activist in Moscow leading demonstrations, and the young activist in New York leading demonstrations. And I want to share with you a little bit what it was like for me growing up hearing the stories about the two of you and your many words in arms. There was a certain pattern to it. You know, I would meet someone, they would hear my family name, they would say, "Oh my goodness, you're Natan and Avital Sharansky's daughter." And then they would say something along the lines of, "Oh, when your mother came to lead a demonstration in our city," and then they would fill in London or Strasbourg or New York, you name it, "she slept on our couch." Or every Pesach, we used to have a chair at our table that was free, and we said it's for your father. And these stories were, of course, very, very meaningful and very moving, and they filled me with great gratitude because I wouldn't exist today if the Jews of the world hadn't fought for my parents and people like them to be free to leave the Soviet Union. But there's honestly also something somewhat alienating about all these stories, because these people that I met used words like unity and peoplehood, and they had these stars in their eyes, and it really felt as if they're talking about this mythical utopia that has absolutely nothing to do with our reality, where we don't have a convenient to define enemy like Paro or Haman or the Soviet Union that we can unite against, where our most vicious disagreements are often amongst ourselves, and when different Jews fight for often opposing causes and goals. So today, what I'd like to invite the two of you, and with you, of course, our audience, to do is to try and delve past those nostalgic memories that people often bring up and that were so meaningful for so many people, and go straight back to the trenches of the struggle, to those difficult moments that day in and day out were really part of the struggle itself, and that young activists today fighting for different causes in a different world can still relate to and hopefully learn from. And since we're in a time of such great uncertainty with Corona ravaging the world and with the political maps both in Israel and in America shifting dramatically under our feet, I'd like to start with that, with uncertainty. Rav Avi, when you started leading demonstrations, when you took your family and your congregation out over and over and over again, there are plenty of people who believed that your actions were misguided, that the Soviet Union will never collapse, that the only way to achieve anything is through quiet diplomacy. And I wanted to ask you, how did you handle that? How did you have the staying power, both for yourself and the ability to inspire your followers to have the same staying power when there's so many open questions hanging over your head?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. And from America, from the Gola, I was one of many tens of millions involved in the struggle. There were so many others who led demonstrations. And I did want to dedicate my input to Yaakov Birnbaum, whom I consider the father of the struggle of blessed memory, and to the tzaddik of the movement, to Glenn Richter, who is unheralded but so modest, so real. He really is your Abba's counterpoint. If Natan was the figure in the center from the Soviet Union, it was Glenn who really was the one who carried the battle year in and year out. And it's of course a great zchut to share this discussion with Natan. Miksat Shivcho B'fanav, Natan is one of the great inspirations in my life and in the life of millions of people worldwide. What inspired us to become involved? It's your father, people like your father. When your father stood up in a Soviet courtroom, knowing that he was going to, in just a few moments, be sentenced to many years in the Gulag, he said, "Facing imprisonment, I say, turning to my people, my Avital, next year in Jerusalem." And then your father, Natan, had the courage to say, "Now I turn to you, the court, the Soviet court. To you, I have nothing to say." Even as I read these words now, I feel chills from the top of my head to my toes. So when Natan stood up and said that, he was our inspiration. If Natan could stand courageously against the Soviet enemy, we living in the West, couldn't we do something just in a tiny way, in a tiny way to follow in his footsteps? And there were others. 1968, when Boris Kochabayevsky, right before he was sentenced, he said, "If I live to my release, I will be prepared to go to my homeland Israel, even if it means going on foot." December 15th will be the 50th anniversary of the Leningrad trials. Mark Yosef Mendelevich and Mark Dimshitz and others, they were sentenced to long sentences, and they attempted to take a plane from the Soviet Union to raise a voice of moral conscience. And they knew they would be caught by the KGB, the Soviet secret police, but they still tried to board the plane and they were caught. I once said to Yosef, I said, "Yosef, even if you would have gotten the plane up in the air, the Soviets would have shot you out of the sky." And he looked at me and he said, "We were ready for that." And I thought of something Dr. Martin Luther King said: "If there's nothing in this world that you're ready to die for, you're not living." And so more than American Jewry did for Soviet Jewry, Soviet Jewry did for American Jewry. With all my heart and soul, Natan, we were junior partners. You were the senior partners. Now, how did we go on with your inspiration? For some, like Glenn, they became involved because they were inspired by the civil rights movement. If Jews could be involved, and if our black brothers and sisters could be involved in demanding rights, we certainly should be doing the same for our own people. In my case, I was the son of Moshe Weiss, who lost siblings during the Shoah, who in 1959 was one of the first to return to where he was raised in Oshvenshim, which became Auschwitz, looking for his brothers and sisters. And we were Jews, our generation, and we could be called never again Jews. Never again. And in that sense, what kept us going was we were angry. We were angry, but we tried to be smart with our anger. We tried to channel our anger into calling out, "Let my people go." And over time, we felt we were not only fighting against the Soviets, but we were involved, as your mother, Avital, whom I consider the greatest activist of the last 50 years of the 20th century. She led the way in making us understand that we were involved in a far broader proactive movement of Geula, the redemption of the Jewish people, doing our share to redeem the Jewish people and to redeem the world.
This is a really beautiful answer, Avavi, and very inspiring one. But if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you an impertinent question before I turn the same question to my father. In what way do you think that people of my generation, when we're fighting our struggles today, trying to repair the world and make it a better place, as you said, in what way can we draw inspiration from the same models, in the sense that we're not fighting for people who are imprisoned and speak up courageously and inspire us to help them? And for most of us, and I'm saying that with pain, but also with honesty, for most of us, the Holocaust is long enough in the past that it's no longer an immediate, urgent inspiration. Where can we find staying power for our struggles, in your opinion?
I think you're correct, Rachel. When we were fighting against a common enemy, the Soviet Union, the issues were black and white. I've often heard Natan say that it was much simpler for him in the Gulag than in the Knesset. Whatever they told him to do, he knew to do the opposite. In the Knesset, it's more complicated. Today, we're trying to inspire a proactive mission, and it's much more nuanced. It's much, much more complex. And yet, I turn to all those who hear my voice and say the following, that with all my heart and soul, I believe that the Pew surveys are wrong. The Pew surveys say that my brothers and sisters Jews are not searching. Anecdotally, I travel the country to campuses, visit synagogues. I think it's the opposite. I think today, more than ever, people and Jews are searching. Searching for meaning, searching for purpose, searching for spirituality. And yes, it's not a bad word, it's not a bad noun to say people are searching, searching for God. They're searching for a Judaism which is rooted but not stagnant, open but with parameters. Yes, I believe Jews, like in the Soviet Jewry movement, when we had a bigger mission, people are searching today for the ideology of Zionism, for the dream of Zionism. And what's required today are the educators and the rabbis and the campus emissaries who can light the fire. That's what we're trying to do in our humble way. A women's rabbinical school, Yeshivat Marat, a men's rabbinical school, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, the Rabbi Amitai Freimans of the world, who spread across the country. We're over 200 now, impacting many tens of thousands of people. People are waiting to be inspired. They just need the leaders who can light the fire. And what the Soviet Jewry movement taught us is that people are waiting to be inspired, waiting. And that with tenaciousness, you need a lot of tenaciousness, day in and day out, we can turn what was a reactive struggle, fighting against something, into a proactive mission of building the dream of Am Yisrael, and I would add Medinat Yisrael. And any struggle that remains reactive, any struggle that remains against something, I call that against-nick Jewry. The struggle, in order for it to endure, must become a proactive Jewry. And for me, it's a natural follow-through from the Soviet Jewry movement. That is, that is, in the battle against the Soviet Union, we now take it to the next step. And we were against demanding freedom, but it's not only a freedom from, but it's a freedom towards the mission, the embrace of the nobility and the grandeur and the beauty of what Judaism has to offer itself and the larger world.
Thank you, Rav Avi. And Father, I'm curious, in your time of uncertainty, Rav Avi pointed out in the beginning of his answer, you pointed out that to a great extent, American Jewry, world Jewry drew courage and strength and inspiration from people like you, Father, in prison. So where did you draw your courage from? Do you also can relate to the idea that it wasn't reactive, it was proactive? What was it you were holding on
Well,
to that gave you strength?
uh, first of all, I was lucky that before I went to prison, before I was arrested, I had like 5 years of activism. When being an activist and then spokesman of our movement, I was in contact with so many Jews who were coming as tourists. I was on phone with so many Jewish activists, the heads of Jewish organizations, the leaders of Jewish organizations. I was in contact with many sportsmen and diplomats who were coming to Soviet Union. They all then were on the list of my accomplices. But I did see and this depth of solidarity, the depth of enthusiasm of Jews from all over the world who are coming from different parts of the world say, oh, your father is from Odessa and my father is from Odessa. We have family. We want to help you. Or those who were saying they had to smuggle our documents to American Jewish organizations and to senators and so on. And sometimes they were trembling from fear when they had to hide it in their underwear to take to the airport. And you say to one of those women, I said, you know what, don't take it. We will find other way. She said, no, you don't understand. I'm not doing it for you. It is so important for us to be part of the history. So I saw all these American Jews discovering their identity and feeling such a strong solidarity. So I knew in KGB when they were threatening to sentence me to death, and they were explaining that I'm absolutely alone, I'm isolated, I will not see, except from these 17 KGB interrogators, I will not see anybody in the world. So I have no choice. I have to accept what they propose me. And they knew that they are lying. Without knowing anything what's happening in the world, I was absolutely sure that Jewish people continue their struggle. And I felt that I am in the middle of huge historical struggle of Jewish people. And that's exactly what I discovered a few years ago. I didn't have any identity, I didn't have any freedom, and I thought that my physical survival is the biggest value. Now I've discovered that there is something bigger than this physical survival, exactly as Avi quoted Martin Luther King, that there are things which are more important for me, and to be the part of this historical struggle, part of these people, and understanding that every word what you are saying now influences on all of them. That's what gave me confidence and the hope. And that's why my last book is called, our book for the Giltroy is called Never Alone. That's exactly what I felt there in prison. I am not alone. All these people are with me. And the other thing which also you had to understand very quickly after you're arrested, you should not try to rely on things which don't depend on you. Whether you will survive physically doesn't depend on you. It depends on KGB. So, but whether you will stay a free person, whether you'll put to yourself real specific aims, for example, how not to help to KGB to make cases against the others, how not to give them any information which can help them, or how to learn about their methods, and then if there'll be opportunity to tell about it. That's something that you can deal with. To decide that you will remain free person until the last day of your life, that depends on you. Why I'm saying it? Because today we are now in Corona, and people are making plans. Oh, if in a month Corona will finish, finally I can go on vacations with my grandchildren. And then they're disappointed again and again. They become desperate and so on. But instead of this, don't rely on things which don't depend on you. put specific plans. Now I have opportunity to learn Hebrew. Now I have opportunity to twin our school, Jewish school, with a school in Israel through Zoom and so on. And again, the young people are speaking about Tikkun Olam, and Tikkun Olam is everything. But don't rely on such abstract things. Make specific Tikkun Olam for my community, for my family, for me personally. That means that I can do A, B, C, D. And then when you, on one hand, feel yourself part of the huge, big historical struggle, and you want to be part of it. On the other hand, you turn these abstract, unreachable aims into very specific aims which fully depend on you. That can give you strength to do it.
This is a very practical advice, both for us in the time of COVID and for us as young activists.
Yes, exactly.
But I have to say
Isn't
that
this
the
something that you
beginning
asked
of your
for?
answer, yeah, no, this is excellent. It's very helpful. It definitely feels relevant. But I have to say that the beginning of your answer, when you spoke about the solidarity, made me feel somewhat like all those stories of all those people who told me about how my mother slept in their house. Again, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is powerful. But what about when you don't have everybody behind you? What about when your brothers and sisters disagree with you? Ravavi, in your book about spiritual activism, you talk about how important it is to stand up for a cause, not because it's popular, but because it's right, and how sometimes that means being in disagreement with your natural allies, with your people. And since in today's world, there's very little consensus, let's put it this way, I would like to ask you about that, about working without consensus. You know, Rabbi Avi, in a different book of yours, in your memoir about your activism in Soviet Jewry, you made a very interesting and subtle point. You mentioned how, since you were an activist, a grassroots activist, and you were working in ways that a lot of the Jewish establishment disliked and actively opposed, at times it was hard and it required reminding yourself that they are not the enemy, that the enemy is the Soviet Union and not the other Jewish organizations. And I'd like to ask you, how do you go on working with all these complicated emotions and enmities and strife in the background hovering over your head?
Well, when one considers the working with the establishment, it's important to recognize that the activists, let me use that term, and let me speak about Glenn Richter and Yaakov Birnbaum's Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, the triple SJ, Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. The first demonstration was in May of 1964, and the establishment, the Federated National Community, did not create a fully funded Soviet Jewry organization until 7 years later, 1971. 7 years when you're struggling to free millions of Jews, that is an eternity. It took 7 years. But that the Soviet Jewry movement began from the fringe, from outside of the establishment, is not an anomaly. As one who has studied the principles of activism, I believe, Rachel, Natan, as you know so well, most movements begin from the outside. Judaism began from the outside. Abraham is called Avram Yivri. The whole world was on one side in Egypt. He was on the other side. I love that time in the Bible where it says, and Moses and Aaron, they came to Pharaoh to say, let my people go. And the rabbis asked, where were the people? They were marching. And they paint this beautiful picture of as they were marching, everybody else dropped out one at a time until the only ones who come before were Moses and Aaron. That's the way it is. That's the way it was in the civil rights movement. When Dr. King went down south, it wasn't just the white clergy that said, Martin, you're a troublemaker. It was his black brothers and sisters who said the same. The anti-war movement of the 60s was also started on the fringe. The Soviet Jewry movement, the Ethiopian Jewry movement, let me mention the name of Grenenberger. It always starts on the outside. And I'll tell you why. Because when you're in the mainstream, you can't afford to take risks. You can only become involved in a cause that you know you're going to win. To take risks could jeopardize your standing as being in the establishment. There's a bureaucracy. There's a red tape. You can lose contact with the Yamcha. And so, in 1969, when Mark Dimshitz and Edward Kuznetsov were sentenced to death, later commuted to 15 years, we were able to pour into the streets because the student struggle was organized. The establishment was not. And I think that that's what ultimately pushed the established to recognize the coast is clear. Now we can jump in. And we welcomed the establishment to come in. But I want to be very honest with you and take a moment on this. When the establishment jumped in, there was an attempt to delegitimize our approach. And that's why at the outset, I was much younger, I was anti establishment. How did they try to delegitimize our approach? They didn't like that we catalyzed the community by reacting swiftly, in your face, sometimes through nonviolent civil disobedience. And they certainly took exception, not all, but many, that we felt that it was important not only to pressure the Soviet Union, but we called out that the Americans are not doing enough and that the American government was in the best position to pressure the Soviets, to make sure that the voice of America broadcasts in Yiddish, to make sure that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which links trade from the United States with freedom of Soviet Jewry, we felt that that was important, but there were many in the establishment, in the Nixon White House, in the Ford White House, at a time when America wanted détente with the Soviet Union, that yes, they were afraid to speak truth to power. Not all, but many opposed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And as a matter of fact, in my book, I quote the story, which was made public in America by Yossi Klein Halevi, was a front page story in Mariv, how three of the most important American Jewish leaders came to Jackson, Senator Henry Jackson, and asked him to withdraw the amendment. And of course, the activists would have, the activists would have none of that. So at the outset, we were alone, and when we became involved, there was an attempt to delegitimize, and yes, there was even an attempt. This is a hard word, Rachel, to dehumanize. I remember meetings when Yaakov Birnbaum, such a righteous man, he was mocked. He was made fun. And it also must say that the Israelis were not there in the beginning. They had their issues. They weren't really that supportive of your father. Your father, Natan, I love that you call Natan father. I love just that expression, Abba. But the Israelis were not happy with your father. He was the head of the Universal Helsinki Watch. That was too universal for them. And they really were pushing very hard that your father not be the symbol that he become. And of course, we disagreed. But here's the key: that over time,
Well,
and I began to realize, and often too late, even after communism fell, I began to realize that I didn't understand that the establishment did play a central role. They made possible the very big solidarity days that we could never organize, even though the rally in Washington was really your father. In my opinion, it was your father alone. They gave strength to the day and day activities of twinning bar bat mitzvahs, wearing bracelets, and of course, without the state of Israel, without American Jewry and the clout, 2 million, almost 2 million Jews could never, ever have been freed. So what seemed to be a cacophony in the end was a symphony. And today I'm no longer anti establishment. I'm not establishment, but I am non establishment. And I will say that my biggest regret is that while we differed with the establishment, and I didn't pull back at all in talking about our differences, I regret very deeply that I maligned many of their motives. The establishment cared as much about Soviet Jewry as I did, as the activists did. They were as passionate, they were as caring. I remember one individual working for the American Jewish Congress who put us down because we were so pushy. I'll never forget one day he showed up at my synagogue and he was so spiritually involved. Phil, that's his first name. Many people will know who I'm referring to. And I said to myself, what a deeply spiritual man. What a beautiful, beautiful Jew. And I learned that when we have differences, it's important to recognize I don't have a monopoly on passionately loving my people. I can learn from others. And were it not for this symphony, we may have been the drummers, but in the end, I recognize our goal was not to drown out the pianists, but for there to be a whole symphony. And I dare say, I think I recognize as an activist the role of the establishment much more than the reverse. To this day, I'm not sure that the establishment understands the role that the Glenn Richters and the Yaakov Birnbaums played as much as I think I've come to understand the critical role that the establishment played in the freedom of Soviet Jewry.
Thank you, Ravavi. You're painting this probing picture, really, of what might be like noise, as you pointed out, but when you look back with the perspective of 2020, right? Hindsight is 2020. Turns out to be an orchestra of different parts that are part of a whole. Is that a picture that you recognize, Father? Would you say that that was also your experience?
Well, Rav Avi made a very strong case for activists. I am only sorry that there is nobody to take a strong case for establishment. And he had real luxury, being one of the outstanding leaders of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, recognized 20 years later that establishment also had a role. I didn't have such a luxury. I was, by the time, a spokesman of our movement. So I had to know all these different organizations who were bitterly competing with one another and rejecting one another. There was, of course, Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry and Union of Councils for Soviet Jewry, two big activist organizations. And then there was Coalition for Soviet Jewry, and there was Conference for Soviet Jewry. There were 35, and a number of other organizations. And so I, as a spokesman, no, an official spokesman, sometimes had to take a risk and to put under risk twice two different Jewish activists or tourists who came to Moscow, who are taking our document, our appeal to Senator Jackson, but one is taking it to Conference for Soviet Jewry and another is taking it to Council for Soviet Jewry. And there is no way that these organizations will exchange these documents. They are on the same street in the Manhattan. So I did have to know how deep is this disagreement. On the other hand, thank God, very quickly understand that for the success of our struggle, it's good that there are all these organizations. But of course, it's very important that there are activists who are closer to me in spirit and in action, but they will have to force the establishment do things. But without the muscle of establishment, without the power of establishment, without political connections of establishment, without the money of establishment, you cannot do anything. And the fact that there are so many organizations, religious and not religious, political, and those who are coming from human rights movement, it gives opportunity to reach practically to every Jew in the world. So so that is a very clear feeling, especially when you are then in prison under interrogations, and you realize how all these disagreements were not important because, after all these organizations were fighting for the same aim. And in the list of KGB files, my files, they were all on the same list. And KGB, when there were like 250 contacts, criminal contacts that I met, KGB didn't care whether somebody was representing student struggle or Union of Councils or Conference for Conference for Soviet Jewry. And the last example, Rabbi mentioned Washington demonstration, and thank you for giving me such a big credit. I have to say, I was the first who came with this idea year and a half before Gorbachev came, because we were expecting that he'll come much earlier. So my first visit to America, and I called that when Gorbachev finally come, I want 400,000 Jews to come to Washington and to remind us there are 400 Soviet Jews who want to leave. So he gave this figure, 400,000, simply in order people will remember that we are speaking about massive aliyah from the Soviet Union in future. But it's true that establishment was absolutely in shock. They said it's impossible. It's very big figures. We can to Washington in winter we can bring maximum 18,000. And Elie Wiesel told me, don't expect anything from establishment. Go to the students, and I went for months of tour from one university to the other, from one community to the other, and it was clear that everybody wanted this demonstration. So in the end, then like when already there were like 6 or 7 weeks before the demonstration, suddenly when it was clear that grassroots want this demonstration, establishment made a decision. And the moment establishment made a decision, the huge money and logistics and airplanes are coming from Los Angeles and Toronto, and trains are coming from New York, and buses from Cleveland. 250,000 Jews came. So was it possible without enthusiasm of activists? No. Was it possible without the real huge, unbelievable logistical operation which establishment did? No. And that only reminds us how it is important that even when we are fighting, not be accusing one another in betrayal and so on, let's remember, after all, that we have one aim: to continue our journey together, to fight for the right of our people to be free and live in accordance with our tradition. And that's much more important than all our disagreements. And in the end, it's such a good cooperation between people who disagree but work for the mutual cause.
It's interesting because it's an inspiring vision of the Soviet Jewish struggle, but again, it raises the same problem for me as a young activist today, because I am friends with many young Jewish activists on the right and on the left, in America, in Israel, in Europe. I don't think that they're seeing themselves as part of one joint struggle, that maybe they have different tactics in, but they're really in the same struggle. I mean, I have friends who are struggling to abolish get refusal, and they see themselves as women struggling against the Orthodox establishment. I have friends in America who are struggling for or against Trump. It's a totally different issue. It's a totally different situation. And those different groups and many, many others that I'm not going to mention by name now don't see themselves as part of one grand movement. So how does this insight that both of you mention in different ways, Rav Avi and Abba, both of you are talking about how different groups are fulfilling different roles and one joint struggle. How is that relevant for me when I'm fighting for a particular cause, trying to change a particular Israeli law, or trying to push a certain policy in America, or any of those things we're fighting for today? Rav Avi, would you like to
Sure.
lead the way here?
First, I want to amplify Natan's description of the large demonstration in Washington. And I recall, Natan, we spoke about it. And what I heard from you was, could the establishment organize a big rally? And my response was, no, no, they can't. And I didn't feel we had the means, the student struggle, to inspire them, to push them to follow through. What I didn't know is that you, Natan, would travel from community to community with David Makovsky, with Jack Lew, and others. And without your input, Natan, it could never, ever have happened. That is a reality. Those are the facts on the ground. And so, in a certain sense, what you did fits very much into the mold that I described about how the idea often comes from the outside. Even you were outside of the establishment. The establishment was pushing back. But then the establishment saw it was happening and they jumped in. As a matter of fact, the second big rally in 2002 in Washington, which was a rally in support of Israel, yes, it could not have been done with the establishment. That's the orchestra, that's the symphony. But it was inspired by a group of interdenominational rabbis after the Park massacre in Netanya. We came out to Dag
Yeah.
Hammarskjöld Plaza with no funds whatsoever, and we said we're going out, and the establishment refused to go out. I remember the Jewish Week's editorials. And that day, tens of thousands came, and we announced there, if we don't hear that we're going to Washington, we're going ourselves. And the next day, there was a president's conference meeting, and they voted to go. And in 1 week, because of what was happening as a reaction, several hundred thousand came out. That, by the way, was the only time I was at a president's conference meeting, because we were pushing for it aside, Natan, from the time you got me into the president's conference meeting when you were meeting them right in May of 1986 when you were freed. You said, Avi has to come in. And they said, what? But I was sitting right up there. I actually was quite uncomfortable. I didn't know how to sit up there, but you kind of showed me all the ways. So what was the question, Rachel? I forgot. I just had to jump in on that.
That's the problem with Rabbi Weiss. He wants to answer his questions.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that just
Well,
touched
they're
me.
good
I'll remember it.
Okay.
It's
questions.
a senior moment.
Yeah. Okay.
What,
Okay.
what
Rav
were you
Avi,
asking about how?
I'm forcing you down to the ground of today, I'm afraid,
Yes,
and
yes.
tell me how this insight that we're all serving the same big goal in our different ways and we're all a symphony is relevant for us when we're not fighting for one joint goal, when different groups are fighting for different things.
I would say two things, and there's so much to say, and I'm sure Natan has so much to offer. The first is I think it's good. I think it's good, whatever one's cause, I think it is good. And so if one is raising a voice against the horror inflicted literally on women who are denied a Jewish divorce, kol hakavod. My concern is that for every Rachel Sharansky, there are probably many, many, many more who are not involved in any cause. And that's the great challenge. That's what your Abba talks about sending emissaries into the campuses and to inspire young people, most of whom are passive, they're uninvolved, to become involved because, as I said earlier, they're waiting to be inspired. And the second thing that I would want to add is I think that there is one cause that can unite us, and that is the cause of Zionism and the state of Israel. I'm not talking about the politics of settlements and right and left and Netanyahu and Gantz and this and that. I'm talking about the dream that today there is a national homeland, a Jewish democratic state. That, I think, for me, is a progressive cause. You know, in the world today, you can be progressive on LGBTQ, on feminism, on the environment, but if you support the state of Israel, consensus wise, we don't want your help. Because Israel is a colonial state. And as I've written in Spiritual Activism, the test of an activist is not one who speaks out for that which is popular, but that which is right. And it's the right thing for Jews to stand up today, and I think Gentiles of moral conscience to say, we support what Israel is all about. And that, I believe, should be a consensus issue that should rally people across the board. That is, whatever your particular cause, whatever your particular branch, foundationally, I think the cause of Zionism could be today the clarion call to speak about Israel as contributing to bringing light to the nations of the world. That's what Israel is about. And that, I think, today can be the national call. From my perspective, while there are great communities around the world, the national destiny of the Jewish people is unfolding where the majority of Jews live today, and that is in the state of Israel. Let that be the clarion call.
It's there's a natural gap between should and is, and I think that many people would agree with you and many people wouldn't. But by bringing into our discussion this the fact that we have, for the first time really in thousands and thousands of years, we have a Jewish sovereign state and strong Jewish communities that live in freedom, is both a unique moment in history. And I've just spent 3 years living in Boston temporarily, and I got to see the power of the Jewish community in the States and how full the life it builds for itself can be. So it's
Rachel,
unique that we can have both.
when you look at the Soviet Jewry movement, in its beginning, you could look at it in terms of what was, and what was then is.
Mm-hmm.
The Jewish community was passive, uninvolved. And the Glenn Richters and the Jacob Birnbaums and the Pam Cohens of the world looked at the movement and saw not what was, but what could be. And so, as it relates to Israel, similarly, I see what could be. Israel is not a colonial state. That's nonsense. And what could be is, I believe that, yes, there are even Jews who oppose even the consensus, foundational ideas of the state of Israel. But the vast majority of Jews, like the vast majority of Jews in the Soviet Union, are indifferent because they're passive, they're on campus. They need someone to light the fire. Birthright has proven that if people are taken to be inspired in Israel, they will be inspired. And that, I believe, is the Tzav Hasha'a today. That, I believe, is what is the greatest challenge facing us. We have a lot of work to do, just as we had a lot of work in 1964 and 65. But it is doable. Im tirtzu, ein zu agada. Keep dreaming and
That's a
making that
very,
dream become a reality.
that is, I mean, it's a very Jewish attitude. That's at the core of God's Lech Lecha to Avram, right? Leave behind what is and pursue what can be. What do you think about it, Father? How do you feel about it?
Well, I agree that it should be like this. It's definitely not the situation today, as I visited more than 100 campuses all over America. There are, of course, Jews who are very enthusiastic about Israel. There are Jews who visited Israel on birthrights, and it really changed all their perspective. There are Jews, little minority, who are actively anti-Israel, and there is a lot of Jews who prefer not to speak about Israel because it's a controversial issue. It makes them non-respected in their surrounding, or their professors will not like it. And the fact that there are so many young Jews who, not only young Jews, by the way, young Americans who are not ready to speak publicly about their political views. And the last poll of Carter said that 62% of Americans prefer not to discuss publicly their political views. That's something very, very frightening. Now, as to going back to common platform, yes, it is good that Jews are for different causes. It's very good. But it's important that we will remember that what is something that unites us? We all want that Jews will continue their journey through civilizations. And what means Jewish identity is important for us. And today, yes, the base of Jewish identity today is the state of Israel. So it is important for us that in future that our grandchildren will continue that tradition or that civilization, which is called Jewish civilization. So for this, we have not to agree with one another. What to do? Half of Jews chose to live in Israel, Jewish democratic state in the Middle East among all these dictatorships, and half of Jews of the world chose to live as a minority in liberal society. And so inevitably they have different sets of priorities. And instead of arguing and accusing that by different set of priorities you're betraying us, let's start listening to one another and understanding that in the end we want one thing together. We want to continue our Jewish journey, and that's why Israel can strengthen your Jewish identity, and you, all Jews, can strengthen a lot our identity, or Israelis that defend Israel in these difficult times. So it's not easy. I know, especially today when everything is so polarized. But Jews have unique opportunity to overcome this polarization of the world because Israelis feel very strongly that their top priority is defending Israel and defending physically our identity. And American Jews feel very strongly that we have to defend our liberal values. So, in this polarized world, to connect our Zionism and our liberalism, that's exactly all the goyim which we can give.
I would just add,
So,
Rachel, if I may, that just picking up on what Natan said, I think we can learn from each other. I think American Jewry can bring a message of a pluralistic
Mhm.
Judaism to Israel, which I think is critical. As an Orthodox rabbi, I believe that spiritual striving and religious coercion, kriyat hadat, in any form, that's an oxymoron. And Israel can learn from America to open up spiritual striving and religious paths, which I think will not only strengthen those who are in the conservative or reform or whatever movement you're in, I think it'll strengthen orthodoxy, because orthodoxy for many in Israel is a turnoff because it's viewed as coercive. And if it would be more open, people would see its beauty. At the same time, I think American Jewry can learn so much from Israeli Jewry. Ask an American Jew, what does it mean to be Jewish? What will they say? They'll say Judaism is an ethnicity, it's a religion, it's a faith, it's a culture. Ask an Israeli, what is it? I'm part of the people of Israel. I'm part of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
I'm part of Medinat Yisrael. Yes, we're a democratic state, but it's a Jewish democratic state. And that
Yeah.
hadar, that we're part historically of a nationhood, I think American Jewry can take those lessons from
Yeah.
Israeli Jewry. And we should, rather than focus on a Judaism which I call functional Judaism, but a mission driven Judaism. That is, that we're part of a peoplehood, of a people with the land, with the state. And covenantally, we're in a partnership with God. Lasot, God says, make this world a better world. And I think young people, we may not see it, they're ready for this message. They're ready to hear the message of Shabbat. What is the message of Shabbat? It teaches the ethics of power. Step back, evaluate why we're doing what we're doing during the week. As Abraham Heschel once said, to have more does not mean to be more. What a beautiful mission driven idea Judaism is all about. The idea of Micha. Yigid lecha adam ma tov u'ma Hashem doresh mimcha, ki masot mishpat v'avat chesed. What does God want from us? To promote a society which is just, a society which is kind, Latznei lechet, and walking humbly with the Lord. Our people are waiting for this message. It's waiting for the Glenn Richters and Yaakov Birnbaums. It's waiting for everyone. And I think everybody is trying. And we've just, if we have failed, it's my failure. It's my failure. And I'm at the last quarter. It's your time, Rachel. It's your time. And it's your time to do it
Yeah,
better than
that's good, Rachel. By
we're
the
doing.
way, you're much closer to the future than me. What do you think
Right?
is, what do you think about opportunity of us being together?
Together
can you
where?
clarify your question? What do you mean? Yeah, what do you mean by being together?
Do you feel that we Israelis and American Jews are diverging or converging? What can give us confidence that we together will make it? Will continue our journey together?
No, I think it's a great challenge,
No,
Natan. And
wait, Avi. We spoke enough. Let's younger generation speak. Uh,
Okay,
uh,
I agree with you.
So,
I absolutely agree.
this younger generation, as a representative of all the younger generation out there,
yeah,
as a representative of
yeah,
myself,
yeah.
when I think of these questions, I think of it honestly less in terms of world Jewry, Israeli Jewry. I think more in terms of individuals. And I think that when I open my eyes and open my heart and I talk to individuals in Israel, in America, in Europe, young Jewish activists, non activists, teachers, educators, parents, working parents, stay at home parents, you name it. What gives me hope, what makes me feel that we are in fact working for one unifying cause, is not a Paro or a Soviet Union, and it's not even a particular cause because we don't agree on any particular cause usually. What gives me hope is that I see in all of these different people I talk to and open my heart to and learn from what I guess you would call spiritual striving, Rav Avi. I see a desire to do good, a desire to take
Absolutely.
everything we inherited as Jews from the world that came before us and use it to reshape the world in a better form. And I guess for me, this is what Judaism has to give the world today. I look at the world and I see this horrible polarization between what one might call conservatives and progressives, or one might call people who are so defensive in the face of change that they want to just hold on to everything exactly the way it used to be, and people who are so eager to make things better that they're willing to throw out the baby with the water. Is that an expression also in English?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in a way, I feel that Judaism offers the antidote because we have a very long history of living rooted in tradition and yet finding ways to innovate from within it. And when I look at my friends, who many of whom are doing these amazing things, I'm not a very strong activist, but I know many who are educators and activists and world builders. And I see how each one of them is using our tradition to reshape the world in a totally different way. I see a certain unity, not of purpose, not necessarily of coalition building in the technical sense, but a unity of motive, a unity of spiritual tenure, if I can say it like that. And that gives me a lot of hope. That makes me think that no matter what conclusions we come to when we talk about big categories like world Jewry, Israeli Jewry, the people are good. The people are striving to use what was to build what will be. And this is something I believe in. And
Good.
I do want to conclude I do want to conclude on this note and say that one thing that I learned from the struggle for Soviet Jewry is to have faith that we can go on doing that, because there are moments when whatever cause I was involved in at the time, I came to feel that it was hopeless, that it was going nowhere, that it was too big to be achieved. And then I thought, if my father and my mother and their comrades in arms like Yurav Avi and like the Glenn Richters of the world and like so many others, like all those people who come to me and say they wore the bracelets or kept the empty chair in their Seder, if those people hadn't believed that just because something doesn't seem like it's possible right now, it's not worth fighting for, I wouldn't exist here. My very life, the fact that I'm here in the flesh, means that, like you said, im tirtzu and the Haggadah, if you will it, it's not a dream. And may we continue learning from our past and reshaping our future. Thank you so much.